My daughter's fiancé grabbed the back of my head and shoved my face straight into wedding cake. The impact sent vanilla frosting exploding across my glasses as 150 guests gasped in shock. Then he threw his head back and laughed like it was the funniest thing he'd ever seen. "Sorry, Pops," he said, still grinning. "Maybe next time you'll know that your place." I stood there, wiping cake from my eyes, while Sophie stared between us in horror. The entire reception had gone dead silent. Brandon thought he'd just humiliated the old man in front of everyone who mattered. He had no idea what he'd just triggered. My name is Daniel Morrison, and I'm about to tell you how one moment of cruelty at my daughter's wedding became the biggest mistake of a predator's life. Because sometimes the people who underestimate you the most are the ones who pay the highest price. If you've ever been disrespected by someone who thought they could get away with it, you'll want to hear every word of this story. Make sure you're subscribed, because what happens next will restore your betrayed injustice. I should start at the beginning, back when Mary was still alive and our little house on Maple Street felt complete. I'm 64 now, a retired mechanic who spent 40 years fixing what others broke. My late wife Mary always said I had a gift for seeing problems before they became disasters. She passed 3 years ago on a Tuesday morning in October, leaving behind the smell of Maxwell House coffee in our morning kitchen and a daughter who meant everything to both of us. Sophie Morrison became my whole world after the funeral. 28 years old, working marketing for a local firm, still calling me daddy when she thought no one was listening. She inherited her mother's laugh and my stubborn streak, plus that same way of humming while she cooked that made the house feel like home again. Which I suppose is why she fell so hard for Brandon Phillips when he came into her life like a well-dressed hurricane. I first met Brandon 18 months ago when Sophie brought him to Sunday dinner. Clean-cut, confident, claimed he was a financial advisor downtown working with high-net-worth clients. He had this way of speaking that made everything sound important, using phrases like portfolio optimization and wealth management strategies, while cutting his pot roast with the precision of a surgeon. Sophie hung on every word like he was revealing the secrets of the universe. But mechanics learn to listen for things that don't sound right. When Brandon talked about his job, something always seemed slightly off pitch. Like an engine with one cylinder misfiring, most people wouldn't notice, but once you've heard it, you can't unhear it. The way he'd pause just a fraction too long before mentioning client names, or how his stories about big deals never quite had the ring of truth. The real test came 6 months later when Sophie started crying over wedding costs. She'd always dreamed of a church ceremony with flowers everywhere, a reception at the country club, the works. Ever since she was little, playing dress-up in Mary's old wedding veil, she'd planned every detail in her head. Problem was, it carried an $85,000 price tag that might as well have been $1 million. "I don't know what to do, Dad," she sobbed into my shoulder one evening, her tears soaking through my old flannel shirt. "Brandon says we should just go to City Hall, that spending money on one day is impractical. But I've wanted this since I was little. I know it's silly to spend so much money on a party." "It's not silly," I told her, smoothing her hair like I used to when she had nightmares. "Every girl deserves her dream wedding. Your mother would have wanted you to have everything you dreamed of." And that night, after Sophie went home to her apartment across town, I sat at my kitchen table with Mary's coffee mug and made a decision that would change everything. I called my old boss at Peterson's garage the next morning before the sun came up. "Jimmy, it's Daniel Morrison. You still need someone for the night shift?" For 18 months, I worked my regular retirement schedule during the day and pulled 12-hour shifts at the garage from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m., 4 nights a week. I sold my prized 1969 Camaro, the one I'd restored with my own hands over 3 summers, piece by piece in the garage behind our house. I canceled my cable subscription, switched to generic groceries, wore the same 3 work shirts on rotation until the collars frayed. I ate bologna sandwiches for lunch and instant coffee for dinner, counting every penny that went into the wedding fund I kept hidden in Mary's old jewelry box. Sophie never knew. When she'd ask how I was managing the wedding contributions, wondering aloud how a retired mechanic could afford such luxury, I'd just smile and say, "Dad will figure something out." Because that's what fathers do. We figure it out. Even when figuring it out means sacrificing everything we have. The wedding invitations went out 3 months ago. Elegant cream cardstock with gold lettering that Sophie had agonized over for weeks. She was radiant when she showed me the final sample, her eyes bright with excitement about the future she was building. Brandon stood beside her, arm around her waist possessively, already acting like he owned everything in the room, including the daughter I'd raised alone for the last 3 years. "This is going to be perfect, Mr. Morrison," he said, not quite meeting my eyes the way he usually avoided direct eye contact when we talked about anything substantial. "Sophie deserves the best, and I'm glad we can give it to her." I nodded and smiled, but something cold settled in my stomach like a stone. The way he said Sophie deserves, like he was the one providing it, like he was the generous benefactor making her dreams come true, instead of the man drowning in debt who'd never contributed a single dollar to the wedding fund. The first real red flag came during that same visit. While Sophie was in the bathroom freshening up, Brandon picked up a small framed photo of Mary from my end table, a candid shot of her laughing in our garden, taken just months before she got sick and everything changed forever. "Nice picture," he said, but his attention wasn't on Mary's face or the joy in her expression. He was examining the frame itself, turning it over to check the back for maker's marks. "Real silver?" "It was my wife's favorite," I replied, watching him carefully and noting how he handled the most precious thing in my house, like it was just another object to be appraised. "Yeah, she had good taste." Brandon set the frame down without the reverence you'd expect someone to show for their future father-in-law's most treasured possession. "You know, Mr. Morrison, you've got some really valuable items in this house. Have you ever had everything appraised for insurance purposes? It's important to know what you're sitting on." The question felt like a probe, testing my awareness of my own assets and whether I understood their value. I filed it away in the growing list of things that didn't feel right about Brandon Phillips, the man who was about to become my son-in-law. 2 weeks before the wedding, I discovered something that changed everything. Sophie had asked me to drop off some paperwork at Brandon's apartment, something about insurance forms that needed signing for the honeymoon. He wasn't home, but his roommate let me in to leave the documents on his desk in the living room. That's when I saw the credit report lying open beside his laptop computer. The numbers jumped off the page like a slap to the face. $230,000 in student loans from a law school he'd apparently never graduated from. $45,000 in credit card debt spread across 7 different accounts. Monthly income that barely covered his minimum payments, leaving nothing for the lifestyle he was showing Sophie. Everything he'd told my daughter about his financial success was a lie. I stood in his sterile apartment, surrounded by furniture that screamed expensive but felt hollow and temporary, and pieces started clicking together like parts of an engine I'd finally figured out how to repair. The BMW with lease payments he couldn't afford, the Rolex that glinted on his wrist during family dinners, the confident talk about investments and retirement planning that never quite made sense when you looked at the details. But it was the stack of mail on his counter that really opened my eyes to the desperation Brandon was hiding. Past due notices from 3 different credit cards, each one more urgent than the last. A formal demand letter from something called Atlantic Recovery Services, with language that made my mechanic's hands shake. And most chilling of all, a handwritten note that simply said, "B. You have until the 15th. No more extensions. We know where you work." M. Today was the 12th. The wedding was the 14th. Brandon Phillips wasn't a successful financial advisor building a future with my daughter. He was a man drowning in debt and threats, grabbing for anything that might save him from going under completely, including my daughter and whatever assets I might have. And I was starting to understand that Sophie's wedding wasn't just the happiest day of her life. It was Brandon's deadline for finding a solution to his problems. The rehearsal dinner was held at Romano's, a cozy Italian place Sophie had loved since childhood for their garlic bread and the way the owner always remembered her name. I had arrived early wearing my best suit and the smile I'd been practicing in the mirror. Tonight, I had a role to play, and everything depended on playing it perfectly. Mr. Morrison! Brandon's voice boomed across the room as he approached with Sophie on his arm, both of them glowing with pre-wedding excitement. Looking sharp tonight. Ready for the big day tomorrow? I shuffled slightly, hunched my shoulders just enough to seem smaller than my actual height, and let my voice carry a little uncertainty. Oh, you know me, Brandon. Just happy to see my little girl happy and getting everything she always wanted. The game began. During dinner, I played the part perfectly. The simple mechanic out of his depth in conversation about Brandon's important career in sophisticated world. I asked innocent questions about his work, nodding along with confused admiration as he painted elaborate pictures of his success managing other people's money. I'm handling portfolios worth millions now, he said, cutting his osso buco with surgical precision while Sophie watched him adoringly. It's all about understanding market psychology, reading the indicators most people miss. The average person just doesn't have the education to make these kinds of decisions. That sounds so complicated, I replied, deliberately stumbling over the words like a man intimidated by intelligence beyond his understanding. I guess I'm just lucky I understand carburetors better than... what did you call them? Portfolios? Brandon laughed, but there was something sharp in his eyes as he looked at me across the table. It's definitely not for everyone. Takes a certain kind of mind and years of training to really master. Sophie squeezed his hand adoringly, completely missing the condescension in his tone. Brandon's so good with money. He's already talking about helping me manage my inheritance someday, making sure I don't make any mistakes that could hurt our future. My fork paused halfway to my mouth as the word inheritance hung in the air between us. Inheritance? Oh, Dad, when you're gone someday, which hopefully won't be for many, many years, I'll need someone to help me understand all the financial stuff. Brandon says there are so many ways people get taken advantage of when they don't know what they're doing with money and investments. Brandon's smile never wavered, but I caught the quick glance he shot in my direction, like a mechanic sizing up a car for parts, calculating what it might be worth if you stripped it down to nothing. That's very thoughtful of you both, I said slowly, letting a little confusion creep into my voice, though I hope that day is still far off. I'm not ready to be planning my own funeral just yet. Of course not, Brandon replied smoothly, reaching over to pat my hand in a gesture that felt patronizing. But it's never too early to plan for the future, especially when you have someone in the family who understands these things and can help protect what you've worked so hard to build. As the evening progressed, I began dropping carefully planned breadcrumbs, each one designed to paint a picture of a vulnerable old man with assets worth protecting. I mentioned my life insurance policy, $500,000, enough to set Sophie up for life. I wondered aloud about all that paperwork that comes with getting older and how confusing modern banking had become. I even commented on how the financial advisors at the bank always seemed to be trying to sell me something I didn't understand. Brandon absorbed every word like a sponge soaking up water, his eyes sharpening with each detail about my supposedly confused financial state. Mr. Morrison, he said during dessert, leaning forward with manufactured concern while Sophie excused herself to check on the cake for tomorrow. If you ever need help organizing your financial paperwork, I'd be happy to take a look. Sometimes it's good to have a fresh set of eyes on these things, especially someone with professional experience. That's very kind of you, I replied, playing the grateful old man perfectly. I have to admit, some of those bank statements are getting harder to follow. All those numbers and investment terms, it's like they're speaking a foreign language sometimes. Well, that's completely normal for someone your age, Brandon said, his voice dripping with false sympathy. The important thing is making sure everything is properly organized, so Sophie never has to worry about complicated legal issues or financial mistakes that could hurt her future. The breadcrumbs were working perfectly. Brandon was already positioning himself as the solution to problems I didn't actually have, setting up the narrative that would justify his eventual takeover of my finances. After dessert, as we stood outside the restaurant saying goodbyes to family members, Brandon pulled me aside for what he called a man-to-man chat near the parking lot where no one could overhear our conversation. Mr. Morrison, I want you to know how much Sophie means to me, he said, his hand heavy on my shoulder in a gesture that felt more possessive than affectionate. I plan to take very good care of her for the rest of our lives. And I hope you'll let me help take care of you too, when the time comes. Help take care of me? I asked, letting genuine confusion creep into my voice. You know, finances, legal paperwork, medical decisions, that sort of thing. It can be overwhelming for people who aren't used to dealing with complex financial instruments and legal procedures. I'd hate to see you get confused and make a mistake that could hurt Sophie's future financial security. The threat was wrapped in concern and family loyalty, but it was still a threat. Brandon was already positioning himself as the competent protector, while painting me as the aging liability who needed management and oversight. I thanked him for his thoughtfulness and climbed into my old pickup truck, the one with 200,000 miles and a tendency to backfire when it was cold. But as I drove home through the quiet streets of our neighborhood, my hands steady on the wheel, I wasn't thinking like a confused old man anymore. I was thinking like a mechanic who'd just identified a serious problem that needed fixing. The next morning, I called Catherine Walsh, an attorney who specialized in elder law. I'd found her name through careful research over the past several weeks. She had 15 years of experience and a reputation for aggressive prosecution of financial abuse cases against elderly clients. Mr. Morrison, she said during our private meeting in her downtown office, what you're describing sounds like a textbook case of predatory behavior. These individuals target elderly people who appear vulnerable or isolated, then use emotional manipulation and family relationships to gain access to their assets. Catherine was a sharp woman in her 50s, with steel gray hair and the kind of direct gaze that probably terrified opposing counsel in court. Her office walls were covered with commendations from elder advocacy groups and photos with satisfied clients who'd fought back against financial predators. I laid out everything I'd observed over the past several months. The lies about Brandon's financial situation, his sudden interest in my estate planning, the way he positioned himself as Sophie's protector while subtly undermining my competence in her eyes. The challenge, Catherine explained, leaning back in her leather chair, is that emotional manipulation and lying to your girlfriend aren't technically illegal. We need evidence of concrete criminal behavior, fraud, forgery, threats, coercion, or attempted theft, something that will hold up in court and convince a judge that this man is dangerous. She pulled out a legal pad and began taking notes. These predators usually escalate to legal action fairly quickly once they think they've established control. They'll file for power of attorney, emergency conservatorship, claims of mental incompetence. If we can prove he's using false pretenses or fabricated evidence, we can charge him with elder financial abuse. But we need him to show his hand first. That's when Catherine explained the trap we were going to set. A carefully orchestrated plan that would give Brandon exactly what he thought he wanted, while documenting every step of his criminal behavior. We're going to make you appear vulnerable enough to justify his intervention, she said, pulling out sample documents from her filing cabinet. But first, we need to understand exactly how these predators operate and what signs they look for. Over the next week, I became a student of my own vulnerability. Catherine connected me with Dr. Michael Stevens, a geriatric psychiatrist who'd spent 20 years studying cognitive decline and the warning signs that financial predators exploit. They look for specific behaviors, Dr. Stevens explained during our consultation: forgetfulness about recent conversations, confusion about financial matters, difficulty following complex instructions, and most importantly, social isolation that makes the victim dependent on the predator for information and decision-making. I practiced looking confused at appropriate moments, learned how to seem just unreliable enough to justify concern, but not so obviously impaired that Sophie would become alarmed and seek medical help. It felt wrong playing weak when I'd never felt stronger or more focused, but I understood the strategy. Meanwhile, I made some strategic purchases that would help me document Brandon's behavior. A pen with a built-in voice recorder that looked completely ordinary, a small camera disguised as a picture frame for my living room, a phone app that could record conversations with the touch of a button. If Brandon was going to threaten me or my family, I wanted every word captured with perfect clarity. The most important preparation was financial. Catherine helped me create a series of decoy documents, fake power of attorney forms, will modifications, account information designed to look legitimate, but contain fatal legal flaws. If Brandon tried to use forged signatures or fraudulent documents, we'd have him cold. These documents will appear completely legitimate to someone without legal training, Catherine explained, showing me the subtle differences that would expose them as fakes. But they contain specific language that makes them completely unenforceable in court. If he tries to use them, he'll be caught in an obvious fraud that carries serious felony charges. I also opened a new checking account at a different bank and transferred most of my assets there, leaving just enough in my main account to make Brandon's bait believable. If he somehow gained access to my primary account, he'd find exactly what I wanted him to find, and nothing more. The irony wasn't lost on me as I set up this elaborate deception. I was building the same kind of trap I used to construct for mice in the garage. Attractive bait, concealed mechanisms, spring-loaded consequences. Brandon was walking into a carefully designed maze, thinking he was the predator when he was actually becoming the prey. Meanwhile, I kept working my night shifts at Peterson's garage, funneling every dollar towards Sophie's wedding fund. The physical exhaustion was worth it when I saw her face light up as each vendor confirmed their services. The florist, the photographer, the caterer, each one another piece of the dream wedding I was determined to give her, but there was something else driving me beyond just protecting my money or even giving Sophie her perfect day. Brandon wasn't just threatening my assets. He was threatening my relationship with my daughter. Every time he mentioned my confusion or forgetfulness in front of Sophie, he was planting seeds of doubt in her mind about my mental capacity. If his plan succeeded, Sophie would gradually distance herself as she became convinced of my incompetence, leaving me completely isolated and under his control. That wasn't something I could allow to happen, not to the daughter who meant everything to me. 5 days before the wedding, I made my first strategic mistake. I left a bank statement visible on my kitchen counter when Brandon came by to discuss final seating arrangements for the reception. It showed a balance of just over $500,000, the life insurance money from Mary's death, plus my retirement savings and the proceeds from selling my beloved Camaro. Brandon's eyes lingered on those numbers just a moment longer than they should have, and I saw his pupils dilate slightly as he processed the implications. "Dad, you really shouldn't leave financial information lying around like this," Sophie chided gently, picking up the statement to put it away. "Anyone could see this stuff." "You're absolutely right," I said, fumbling with the papers like I was embarrassed by my carelessness. "I get so scattered sometimes, leaving important things where they don't belong. Good thing you two are here to keep me straight and remind me about these things." Brandon offered his most understanding smile, the one that never quite reached his eyes. "We all forget things sometimes, Mr. Morrison. That's why it's so important to have people you trust helping with the important stuff, especially financial matters that can be so confusing." The hook was set perfectly. Now I just had to wait for Brandon to take the bait and show me exactly who he really was. 3 days before the wedding, Brandon suggested we meet for coffee to discuss some practical matters that couldn't wait until after the honeymoon. He chose a small cafe downtown, away from places where Sophie might randomly appear and overhear our conversation. I arrived first, choosing a corner table where the hidden recorder in my shirt pocket would pick up our conversation clearly. When Brandon walked in 20 minutes later, I noticed immediately that he looked more stressed than I'd ever seen him. There were dark circles under his eyes, his usually perfect hair seemed hastily combed, and his hands shook slightly as he ordered his espresso. "Thanks for meeting me on such short notice, Mr. Morrison," he said, sliding into the seat across from me with obvious nervous energy. "I've been thinking about our conversation the other night, and there are some things we really need to discuss." "Which conversation was that?" I asked, playing the confused card perfectly, while the recorder captured every word. about helping with your financial planning and making sure everything is properly organized for Sophie's future. I'd hate for her to have to deal with complicated estate issues if something unexpected happened to you. I blinked slowly, as if trying to follow his meaning through a fog of confusion. Estate issues? I'm not planning on going anywhere anytime soon. Of course not. And I hope you stay healthy for many years to come, Brandon said, stirring his espresso with deliberate calm that didn't match the tension in his shoulders. But managing accounts, handling paperwork, making sure bills get paid on time, it can be overwhelming, especially as we get older and our minds aren't quite as sharp as they used to be. Brandon was already laying the groundwork for his claims of my mental incompetence, building a paper trail of conversations where he expressed concern about my cognitive abilities. Whatever pressure he was under from his creditors, it was clearly getting worse. I could see the desperation in his eyes as he looked at me across the table like I was the solution to all his problems. I suppose that makes sense, I said, allowing just enough hesitation to seem uncertain. But wouldn't Sophie handle all that stuff when I'm gone? She's smart, probably smarter than her old man. Sophie's wonderful, but she doesn't have any experience with financial management or complex legal procedures. She could easily be taken advantage of by unscrupulous people who prey on grieving families during vulnerable times. Much better to have everything properly organized ahead of time with someone who knows what they're doing. The irony was staggering. Brandon warning me about unscrupulous people while actively planning to become exactly that kind of predator himself. He reached into his briefcase and produced a folder of official-looking documents that must have taken him hours to prepare. I've taken the liberty of putting together some basic paperwork that would make everything much simpler for everyone involved. Just standard power of attorney forms, nothing complicated or unusual, and the forms looked completely legitimate, probably downloaded from legal websites and carefully modified with my personal information. If I'd actually signed them with full legal authority, Brandon would have gained complete control over my finances within 24 hours of my signature. "This is very thoughtful of you to prepare all this," I said, taking the papers with hands that trembled just slightly, "but it's a lot to understand and process. Could I maybe think about it for a day or two before making such a big decision?" Brandon's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and I could see the effort it took for him to maintain his helpful facade. "Of course you can take your time. But honestly, Mr. Morrison, you shouldn't wait too long with these things. They're much easier to handle when you're feeling clear-headed and able to focus. You've seemed a little scattered lately during our conversations." "Scattered?" I asked, injecting just the right note of concern into my voice. "Just small things that probably don't mean anything serious," Brandon said with false reassurance. "Forgetting where you put that bank statement, seeming confused about basic financial concepts we've discussed. It's completely normal for someone your age, but it's exactly why it's so important to get these safeguards in place before things get any worse." Brandon was already building his legal case, documenting my supposed incompetence for future court proceedings that would strip away my rights and give him control over everything I had worked for. "I appreciate your concern for my well-being," I said carefully. "But what if I decide I don't want to sign anything right now? What if I want to wait and see how I feel in a few months?" His expression shifted subtly, and for just a moment, the helpful mask slipped enough to reveal something much colder underneath. "Mr. Morrison, I think you need to understand something important about how these situations work. When elderly people start showing signs of confusion or cognitive decline, their families have legal options available to protect them. If someone isn't capable of making rational decisions anymore, the court system can step in to protect them and their assets from potential harm." The threat was barely veiled now. Submit to his control voluntarily, or he'd use the legal system to force the same result. "You mean something like a conservatorship?" I asked, letting my voice shake slightly. "Exactly. Though I'm sure it won't come to that extreme measure. You seem like a reasonable man who wants what's best for Sophie and her future happiness." I signed the decoy documents Catherine had prepared, using a deliberately shaky hand and poor penmanship that suggested declining motor skills. Brandon watched with obvious satisfaction as I fumbled with the pen and had to restart my signature twice. "There," I said, pushing the papers back across the table. "I hope I did that right. My handwriting isn't what it used to be. Brandon's smile was predatory now, like a shark that had just tasted blood in the water. You did just fine, Mr. Morrison. Perfect, actually. But what Brandon didn't know was that the documents he'd just witnessed me sign had no legal authority whatsoever. Catherine had designed them to look completely legitimate while being utterly worthless in any court of law. More importantly, every word of our conversation was now recorded in crystal clear digital audio, including his explicit threats about using conservatorship proceedings to control my assets. The night before the wedding, as I was getting ready for bed and trying to calm my nerves about what was coming, my doorbell rang at nearly 10 p.m. Brandon stood on my front porch, looking more agitated and desperate than I'd ever seen him. "I hope you don't mind me stopping by so late," he said, pushing past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation. "I realized I forgot to explain some important details about those forms you signed today." For the next 30 minutes, Brandon outlined his detailed plans for helping me manage my affairs after the wedding. The hidden recorder in my jacket captured everything. His dismissive comments about my mental capacity, his specific plans to consolidate my accounts under his direct oversight, his casual mention of how old people really shouldn't be making major financial decisions anyway when they can't understand the consequences. "The important thing to understand," he concluded, pacing around my living room like he already owned every piece of furniture, "is that Sophie never has to worry about you making a mistake that could cost her everything she deserves. This way, I can protect both of you from any problems that might come up." Tout. I noticed how he kept saying protect and help, when what he really meant was control and steal. Like so many predators, he'd convinced himself that his victims should be grateful for the abuse. "I appreciate you looking out for our family," I said quietly, playing the grateful father-in-law one last time. "It's good to know Sophie has someone who cares so much about her financial security." "Exactly. And between you and me, Mr. Morrison, it's probably better if she doesn't know all the details about your condition right away. No need to worry her unnecessarily while she's enjoying being a newlywed and adjusting to married life." Brandon was already planning to isolate me from my own daughter, controlling the flow of information between us so Sophie would only hear his version of events. If his scheme worked, she would gradually become convinced that I was losing my mind, making her dependent on Brandon for information about my health and well-being. When he finally left my house that night, I sat in my living room, looking at Mary's photograph on the mantel and thinking about the woman who taught me that sometimes the most important battles are fought quietly, with patience and planning rather than anger and confrontation. Tomorrow was Sophie's wedding day. Tomorrow, Brandon would reveal his true nature to the world in front of 150 witnesses, and I would be ready for whatever came next. I woke up on Sophie's wedding day to the smell of coffee brewing and the weight of everything that was about to unfold. The ceremony itself was beautiful, Sophie absolutely radiant in her grandmother's pearls, walking down the aisle of St. Mark's Church, where Mary and I had been married 30 years ago, in a much smaller, simpler celebration. Brandon looked confident and handsome in his expensive tuxedo, playing the part of the devoted groom perfectly, as he promised to love and protect my daughter for the rest of their lives. During the exchange of vows, I watched him make those sacred promises and wondered how many lies could fit inside a single moment of supposed truth. The reception at Riverside Country Club was everything Sophie had dreamed of since childhood. White roses everywhere, a string quartet playing softly in the background, tables set with china that caught the afternoon light just right and made everything look like a fairy tale come to life. I'd made it all happen, every single detail paid for with night shifts and sacrifices that Brandon would never understand or appreciate. During the cocktail hour, I positioned myself near the bar, playing my assigned part as the proud but slightly overwhelmed father who was just trying to keep up with all the excitement. That's when I overheard Brandon talking to his groomsmen by the terrace doors, thinking he was far enough away that no one important could hear their conversation. "Just have to get through today and tonight," he was saying, loosening his tie and checking his watch, like he had somewhere more important to be. Then I can start implementing some necessary changes around here. What kind of changes? Asked his best man, Craig, a thin guy who seemed to share Brandon's taste for expensive clothes he couldn't afford and questionable moral standards. Sophie's dad is getting pretty scattered lately, making poor decisions, forgetting important things. Someone with experience needs to step in before he does something that seriously hurts Sophie's financial future. Lucky for her, she just married someone who knows exactly how to handle these kinds of delicate family situations. Craig laughed uncomfortably, clearly unsure how to respond to such a cold calculation. So you're going to take over the old man's finances? Let's just say I'm going to make sure everyone's best interests are properly protected, Brandon replied with a smile that had nothing warm about it. The guy's sitting on $500,000 and doesn't even understand basic investment principles. It's almost criminal to let that kind of money just sit there stagnating when it could be put to much better use. The hidden camera in my boutonniere recorded every word, every gesture, every cold calculation about my family's future. What if he doesn't want your help managing his money? Craig asked. Brandon's smile turned sharp and predatory. Oh, he will. Trust me, by next week, Daniel Morrison will be practically begging me to take care of all his financial responsibilities. As the reception moved into dinner service, I felt the weight of the approaching moment when everything would change forever. Sophie was glowing with happiness, surrounded by friends and family who'd come to celebrate her special day, completely unaware that her new husband was planning to systematically destroy her relationship with her father. I spent the dinner hour watching Brandon work the room like a politician, noting how he positioned himself in every conversation to gather information. He was methodically asking my old friends about my health, my daily habits, any signs of confusion or memory problems they might have noticed in recent months, building a comprehensive case before he had even filed the first legal document. Daniel's been having some memory issues lately, I heard him tell my neighbor, Frank, between the salad and main courses. Nothing too serious yet, but you know how these things can progress in people his age. Sophie and I are just trying to make sure he gets the support and guidance he needs. Frank nodded sympathetically, completely unaware that he was being manipulated into providing future testimony. Well, it's good that he has family looking out for him during this time. Absolutely. Though between you and me, I'm a little concerned about some of the financial decisions he's been talking about lately, Brandon continued, planting seeds of doubt about my competence. Some pretty risky investment ideas that could really hurt Sophie if something went wrong. Brandon was systematically creating a network of witnesses who would later testify to my supposed incompetence and his responsible concern for my welfare. The cake-cutting ceremony was scheduled for 8:30, the climactic moment of Sophie's dream wedding, a towering 3-tier creation with vanilla buttercream and delicate sugar flowers that had taken the baker 3 days to complete. Sophie and Brandon posed for photos, silver knife poised over the bottom tier, both of them laughing at something the photographer had said to get them to relax. "Make a wish for your future together, sweetheart," I called out, raising my champagne glass in a toast to their happiness. That's when Brandon looked directly at me across the reception hall, his eyes cold despite the smile on his face for the cameras. Later, during the police investigation, we'd learned that one of his gambling associates had been calling him repeatedly all week, making increasingly violent threats about the money he owed. Brandon was desperate, cornered like a dangerous animal, and looking at me like I was his salvation. As the photographer called for more romantic poses and the guests gathered closer to watch, Brandon suddenly grabbed a large handful of the beautiful wedding cake. "Hey, Mr. Morrison," he called out, his voice carrying that false cheerfulness that had always made my skin crawl. "Come get a closer look at this gorgeous cake you helped make possible." I approached innocently, still playing the role of the doting father who just wanted to share in his daughter's joy. The guests gathered around us in a circle, cameras and phones ready to capture what they assumed would be a sweet family moment between father, daughter, and new son-in-law. Instead, Brandon grabbed the back of my head with his free hand and shoved my face directly into the elaborate wedding cake with enough force to collapse the entire bottom tier. The impact was much harder than it needed to be for any kind of joke. Hard enough to hurt, hard enough to humiliate, hard enough to send a clear message about the new power dynamic in our family. Vanilla buttercream filled my mouth and nose, making it difficult to breathe. I felt the cake's delicate structure completely collapse under the brutal force, sugar flowers scattering across the white tablecloth like broken dreams. For a moment that stretched like an eternity, the elegant reception hall fell completely silent, except for the string quartet, who stopped playing mid-note when they realized what had just happened. 150 people stared in absolute shock as I slowly lifted my head, cake and frosting dripping from my glasses, my dignity somehow intact, even in this moment of deliberate humiliation. Brandon threw back his head and laughed with genuine pleasure, not just a polite chuckle or embarrassed giggle, a full-throated laugh of satisfaction that echoed off the elegant walls and seemed to go on forever while everyone watched in stunned disbelief. "Sorry about that, Pops," he said, still grinning while I carefully wiped frosting from my eyes. "Couldn't resist having a little fun. Maybe this will teach you not to get too close when the important people are trying to have their moment." I stood there with cake sliding down my face and staining my best suit, watching my daughter's expression transform from confusion to horror to embarrassment as she realized what her new husband had just done to her father. Some guests started laughing uncomfortably, not sure how to react. Others looked away, embarrassed by the cruelty they'd just witnessed. But I just smiled calmly, pulled out my handkerchief, and began cleaning my glasses with steady hands. "That's quite all right, Brandon," I said clearly, my voice carrying across the silent room. "I'm sure you had your reasons for doing that." What I didn't say was that the hidden camera had captured every second of premeditated humiliation, every laugh, every cruel word. Brandon had just provided the perfect evidence of his true character for a courtroom full of strangers to judge. 20 minutes later, as I was cleaning vanilla frosting out of my hair in the men's room, Brandon appeared beside me at the marble sinks. His reflection met mine in the mirror, and for the first time all evening, his mask of false charm was completely gone. "Sorry about that little incident out there, Mr. Morrison," he said, but his tone made it clear he wasn't sorry at all. "I guess I got a little carried away with the wedding celebration. Hope you understand, it was all in good fun." I continued methodically wiping frosting from my collar, taking my time with each spot. "Of course I understand, Brandon. These things happen at weddings." "Good. I'm glad you're being such a good sport about it," he said, adjusting his tie in the mirror and admiring his reflection. "Wouldn't want any hard feelings between us, especially since we're family now and we'll be spending a lot more time together." The recorder in my jacket pocket was still running, capturing every word of what came next. "Speaking of family," Brandon continued, "I was thinking we should probably get together early next week to finalize those financial arrangements we discussed. The sooner we get everything properly organized and documented, the better it will be for everyone involved." "What kind of arrangements?" I asked, playing confused one final time. "You know, the power of attorney paperwork, account management, making sure all your legal affairs are in order. With your memory issues getting progressively worse, we really can't afford to wait much longer before taking action. Tonight was actually a perfect example of how confusion and poor judgment can lead to embarrassing accidents." Brandon was already rewriting history, turning his deliberate assault into evidence of my supposed mental incompetence and poor decision-making abilities. "I see," I said slowly, still playing the part. "And what if I decide I don't want to sign anything or make any changes right now?" His reflection met mine in the mirror, and for a moment, every pretense dropped away completely. "Mr. Morrison, I don't think you really understand how these situations work in the real world. When elderly people start showing obvious signs of dementia and cognitive decline, their families have legal options available to protect them. If someone clearly isn't capable of making rational decisions anymore, the court system can and will step in to protect them and their assets from harm." "You mean something like a conservatorship hearing?" "Exactly right. Though I'm sure it won't come to that kind of extreme legal action," he said with false reassurance. "You seem like a reasonable man who wants what's best for Sophie and her future happiness." Brandon paused dramatically, letting the full weight of his threat sink in. Of course, if you did force us to go that route through the courts, it might be quite embarrassing for everyone involved. Public hearings, detailed medical evaluations, sworn testimony about your declining mental state and inability to care for yourself. Not the kind of thing a proud man would want his daughter and her friends to witness and remember. The threat was crystal clear now: submit to his control voluntarily and quietly, or he'd drag me through a public legal humiliation that would destroy my relationship with Sophie forever. Well, I said, drying my hands with deliberate care, I suppose I should think very carefully about what would be best for everyone in our family. I'm really glad you see it that way, Mr. Morrison. It shows you're still capable of making good decisions when you focus, Brandon said, straightening his jacket and transforming back into the confident predator. I'll give you a call first thing Monday morning so we can set up an appointment with my legal contacts. The sooner we get all this handled properly, the better it will be for all of us. As Brandon left the restroom to return to his wedding reception, I looked at myself one final time in the mirror. Cake still clung to my hairline, and my dress shirt was permanently stained with buttercream frosting, but my eyes were completely clear and focused. Tomorrow, Brandon Phillips would discover exactly who he'd been threatening and what kind of man he'd chosen to underestimate. Monday morning arrived with unseasonably cold October air and the sound of my phone ringing at exactly 7 a.m. Catherine Walsh's voice was crisp, professional, and deadly serious. It's happening, Daniel. Brandon filed an emergency conservatorship petition first thing this morning at the county courthouse. He's claiming you're showing progressive signs of dementia and are vulnerable to financial exploitation by unscrupulous individuals. I wasn't surprised by the news, but hearing it still sent ice water through my veins. What evidence is he presenting to support his claims? He's citing the wedding incident as proof of your diminished capacity and poor judgment. Claims you've been making erratic financial decisions and showing memory problems that indicate serious cognitive decline. He's requesting immediate temporary conservatorship pending a full court-ordered competency evaluation. The speed of Brandon's legal assault was breathtaking. Less than 18 hours after humiliating me in public, he was already moving through the court system to seize complete legal control over my entire life. There's more, Catherine continued grimly. He's also filed a request to freeze all your accounts immediately, claiming you might hide or waste assets before the hearing. And Daniel, he's specifically requesting legal authority to place you in a memory care facility if the court deems it necessary for your safety. Can he actually do that? I asked, though I already knew the answer would be disturbing. Unfortunately, he can try, and some judges do err on the side of extreme caution when it comes to protecting elderly people from potential harm. The good news is that emergency conservatorship requires a substantial burden of proof that most predators can't meet. Catherine's voice took on a harder, more determined edge. But Brandon made one critical mistake in his haste to grab control. He's provided us with the perfect legal opening for our counterstrike, and we're going to hit him with everything we have. By noon that same day, Catherine had filed comprehensive elder abuse charges with the district attorney's office. Our evidence package was overwhelming and undeniable. Crystal clear recorded conversations where Brandon discussed manipulating and controlling me, detailed documentation of his massive debts and false financial claims, high-definition video proof of his deliberate assault at the wedding reception. More importantly, she'd requested an immediate restraining order preventing Brandon from contacting me or attempting to access any of my accounts, pending a full investigation of his criminal behavior. The court's response was swift, decisive, and exactly what we'd hoped for. By 3 p.m., Brandon received official notice that he was under active criminal investigation for elder financial abuse, assault, and filing false legal documents. His conservatorship petition was suspended indefinitely, pending resolution of the serious criminal charges against him. But Brandon wasn't finished fighting for control. At 4:30 that afternoon, my phone rang with a call that broke my heart. It was Sophie, and she was crying harder than I'd heard since her mother's funeral. Dad, I don't understand what's happening to our family. Brandon says you're trying to destroy our marriage because you never approved of him. He says you're not thinking clearly anymore, and that's the only reason you're making up these terrible stories about him. Listening to her defend the man who was systematically trying to destroy us both was one of the most painful experiences of my life. Sophie, sweetheart, I know this is confusing and frightening, but I need you to trust me for just a little while longer until we can sort out the truth. Can you do that for me? I want to trust you, Dad, I really do. But Brandon showed me all the legal paperwork. You signed official documents giving him power of attorney over your finances. Then you apparently forgot about it completely and started accusing him of trying to steal from you. That's not normal behavior for someone who's thinking clearly. Brandon was using her love and concern for me as a weapon against both of us, twisting her natural worry about my well-being into support for his criminal scheme. Those documents aren't what they appear to be, I said very carefully, not wanting to reveal too much over the phone. Just please wait until the court hearing on Thursday, okay? Let the medical experts and legal professionals sort out the truth from the lies. What experts? What hearing? Dad, you're really scaring me with all this talk about lawyers and courts and investigations. I know it's scary, baby. I know it doesn't make sense right now, but sometimes the people who love us most have to do things that seem frightening at the time in order to protect what really matters. Please just trust me for a few more days. After she hung up on me, I sat alone in my quiet kitchen, surrounded by the familiar sounds of the old house settling into evening. Tomorrow would bring the court-ordered competency evaluation that would either vindicate me or destroy everything I'd worked for. Thursday would bring the hearing that would decide the fate of my family, but that night I allowed myself one moment of genuine doubt and self-questioning. What if I was wrong about everything? What if my own grief and loneliness since Mary's death had made me paranoid and suspicious? What if Brandon really did care about Sophie's well-being, and I was destroying her happiness over threats that existed only in my imagination? Then I closed my eyes and remembered the sound of Brandon's laugh when my face hit that wedding cake, and I knew with absolute certainty that I wasn't imagining anything. The competency evaluation took place Tuesday morning in a sterile conference room at the county courthouse. Dr. Michael Stevens, the geriatric psychiatrist Catherine had recommended, spent over 3 hours putting me through an exhaustive battery of tests designed to measure cognitive function, decision-making capacity, and susceptibility to financial manipulation. Mr. Morrison, he said afterward, reviewing his detailed notes in his office across town, your test scores indicate cognitive function well within normal ranges for someone your age. Your memory is sharp, your reasoning skills are completely intact, and you show no signs whatsoever of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or any other condition that would impair your decision-making capacity. Brandon had been so confident that the medical evaluation would support his claims about my mental decline. He had no idea what the doctor had actually discovered. In fact, Dr. Stevens continued with obvious professional satisfaction, your performance on several of the more complex tests was quite impressive for someone of any age. You demonstrate excellent problem-solving abilities, clear understanding of complex financial concepts, and you show remarkable awareness of potential manipulation tactics that predators use against elderly victims. Wednesday brought Lisa Rodriguez, the digital forensics expert Catherine had hired, to analyze our recorded evidence. She spent the entire morning in Catherine's office, examining every piece of audio and video with the methodical precision of someone who testified as an expert witness in dozens of similar cases. The audio quality is absolutely excellent, she said, adjusting her professional headphones as Brandon's recorded voice filled the room with his threats and manipulations. This provides clear, undeniable evidence of premeditation, deliberate emotional manipulation, and explicit threats of legal coercion. This isn't someone genuinely concerned about an elderly person's welfare. This is detailed documentation of someone planning systematic theft. And she pulled up the wedding video on her laptop computer, analyzing it frame by frame with sophisticated software that could detect the smallest details. "Look at this particular sequence right here," she said, pointing to the screen. "You can clearly see Mr. Phillips scanning the room, making sure he has a large audience before he grabs Mr. Morrison's head. Notice how he positions himself for maximum visual impact. This isn't a spontaneous moment of playful wedding fun. It's a carefully calculated public humiliation designed specifically to support his later legal claims of incompetence." The evidence against Brandon was overwhelming and undeniable, but Catherine had saved one final surprise for the upcoming hearing. Thursday morning arrived with gray skies and the weight of everything we'd worked toward. The courtroom was packed with observers, including several reporters who'd gotten wind of the unusual case. Sophie sat in the front row directly behind Brandon, looking pale and confused and heartbroken. Catherine Walsh and I took our places at the defendant's table, though technically I was the one being accused of incompetence. Judge Patricia Harrison called the hearing to order at exactly 9 a.m. She was a stern woman in her 60s with silver hair and a reputation for thorough preparation and zero tolerance for courtroom theatrics or legal games. "We are here today to consider Mr. Phillips' emergency petition for conservatorship over Mr. Daniel Morrison," she began in a voice that commanded absolute attention. "Mr. Phillips claims that Mr. Morrison is suffering from progressive cognitive decline and is therefore vulnerable to financial exploitation. However, I also have before me serious criminal charges filed by the district attorney's office alleging that Mr. Phillips himself has engaged in a pattern of elder financial abuse." Brandon's attorney was a nervous young man named Wilson, who looked increasingly uncomfortable as the morning progressed and the evidence mounted against his client. "Your Honor," Wilson began, standing to present their case, "my client is genuinely concerned about his father-in-law's recent behavior and apparent mental decline. Mr. Morrison has shown repeated signs of confusion, memory problems, and increasingly poor judgment. Just this past weekend, at Mr. Phillips' wedding reception, Mr. Morrison became agitated and caused a significant disruption that required immediate intervention to prevent further incident." It was a masterful legal reframing of the cake assault, turning Brandon's deliberate attack into evidence of my supposed mental instability and disruptive behavior. "Furthermore, Your Honor," Wilson continued, "Mr. Morrison signed legal documents granting my client power of attorney, then apparently forgot about the transaction completely and began making paranoid accusations of attempted fraud. This kind of severe memory loss, combined with paranoid thinking, clearly indicates serious cognitive decline that poses a real danger to his financial well-being." Catherine Walsh rose to respond, and I could see the fire of righteous anger burning in her experienced eyes. "Your Honor, we will demonstrate beyond any reasonable doubt that Mr. Morrison is fully competent and mentally sharp, and that the alleged memory problems and confusion are actually evidence of Mr. Phillips' systematic manipulation, threats, and attempted fraud. We will also prove that Mr. Phillips has engaged in a deliberate pattern of elder abuse that extends far beyond this particular case." She called Dr. Michael Stevens as her first expert witness. "Doctor, based on your extensive evaluation, what is your professional opinion regarding Mr. Morrison's cognitive abilities and mental competence?" "Your Honor, Mr. Morrison's cognitive function is not only normal, but actually quite impressive. His memory is exceptionally sharp, his reasoning skills are completely intact, and he shows absolutely no signs of dementia, Alzheimer's disease, or any other condition that would impair his decision-making capacity or make him vulnerable to manipulation. In your expert medical opinion, doctor, would someone with Mr. Morrison's demonstrated cognitive abilities be easily exploited financially?" "Absolutely not, Your Honor. Mr. Morrison would be extremely difficult to take advantage of without deliberate deception and manipulation by someone he trusts implicitly. He is fully capable of managing his own affairs and making completely informed financial decisions." Wilson cross-examined Dr. Stevens aggressively, but the doctor's conclusions were unshakable and backed by extensive test results. The medical evidence was absolutely clear. I was completely mentally competent. Catherine then called Lisa Rodriguez to present our digital evidence to the court. Ms. Rodriguez, please tell the court what you discovered in your professional analysis of the audio and video recordings provided by Mr. Morrison. Lisa's expert testimony was absolutely devastating to Brandon's case. She played carefully selected excerpts from his recorded conversations, highlighting each threat, manipulation, and admission of criminal intent. His own voice filled the courtroom, laying out his detailed plans to control my finances, dismiss my capacity to make decisions, and isolate me from my daughter. The wedding video played on the courtroom's large screen was the final devastating blow. Judge Harrison and everyone else in the room watched in complete silence as Brandon deliberately scanned the room, grabbed my head, and shoved my face into the wedding cake with obvious malicious intent, then laughed with genuine pleasure at my humiliation. Your Honor, Lisa concluded with professional certainty, this video evidence clearly shows that this was not the spontaneous behavior of someone concerned about an elderly person's welfare. This is documented proof of deliberate abuse and premeditated public humiliation specifically designed to support false future claims of mental incompetence. But Catherine Walsh had saved the biggest courtroom surprise for the very end of our case. Your Honor, I would like to call Mr. Daniel Morrison to testify on his own behalf. As I approached the witness stand, I could see Sophie in the gallery, with tears streaming down her face as she finally began to understand the full scope of what she'd been watching unfold. Catherine's first question was deceptively simple. Mr. Morrison, did you knowingly and intentionally give Mr. Phillips legal power of attorney over your finances? No, Your Honor, I absolutely did not. But the court has been shown documents that clearly bear your signature. Those documents were specially prepared by Ms. Walsh as legal decoys, Your Honor. They were deliberately designed to appear legitimate while having no actual legal authority whatsoever. Mr. Phillips witnessed me sign completely worthless paperwork that was created specifically to test his true intentions regarding my assets. The courtroom erupted in surprised murmurs as people realized the implications. Brandon's face went completely white as he finally understood that he'd been systematically outmaneuvered from the very beginning. Mr. Morrison, why did you go to such elaborate lengths to test and document Mr. Phillips's behavior? Because I had discovered that he was lying extensively about his financial situation and was systematically targeting my family for exploitation, Your Honor. I needed to know exactly how far he was willing to go to gain control of my assets, and I needed legal evidence that would hold up in court. Catherine then introduced comprehensive evidence of Brandon's massive debts, his false claims about career success, and most damaging of all, official records from the district attorney showing 2 previous cases where Brandon had attempted identical schemes against other elderly victims in different counties. Your Honor, Catherine concluded with quiet satisfaction, this is not an isolated incident or a misunderstanding between family members. Mr. Phillips has an established pattern of targeting vulnerable elderly people for systematic financial exploitation. Mr. Morrison is not his first intended victim. He's simply the first one who was smart enough and prepared enough to fight back effectively. Judge Harrison listened to both sides' final arguments with a completely neutral expression that gave away nothing of her thinking. When both attorneys finished their presentations, she didn't hesitate for even a moment. Mr. Phillips, she said, turning her attention directly to Brandon, you have presented this court with a petition claiming that Mr. Morrison is mentally incompetent to manage his own affairs, while simultaneously providing extensive evidence that you have been systematically manipulating, threatening, and abusing him. Dr. Stevens's comprehensive medical evaluation confirms that Mr. Morrison suffers from no cognitive impairment whatsoever. She paused dramatically, letting her words sink in throughout the packed courtroom. The evidence clearly suggests that you deliberately assaulted Mr. Morrison at a public event, threatened him with forced legal action if he didn't submit to your financial control, and filed knowingly false claims about his mental capacity. This court finds absolutely no basis for any form of conservatorship and hereby dismisses your petition with prejudice. Furthermore, Judge Harrison continued with obvious anger, I am immediately referring this entire matter to the district attorney for prosecution on charges of elder financial abuse, assault, and battery, and filing false legal documents with intent to defraud. Bailiff, please place Mr. Phillips under arrest. The courtroom exploded into absolute chaos as handcuffs clicked around Brandon's wrists. Sophie collapsed into heartbroken sobs, finally understanding the complete scope of what her new husband had attempted to do to her family. Reporters rushed for the exits to file their stories about the dramatic courtroom reversal. But I just sat quietly at the witness stand, watching justice work exactly as it should when good people refused to give up. The aftermath of the trial unfolded quickly over the following weeks. Brandon pled guilty to all charges, rather than face a lengthy public trial that would expose even more of his criminal behavior. He received a 3-year prison sentence, though he would likely serve only 18 months with good behavior. More importantly for Sophie, the marriage was annulled when it became clear that Brandon had committed fraud to obtain the marriage license by deliberately lying about his debts, criminal history, and financial situation. Sophie and I met for coffee exactly 1 week after the hearing, at the same small downtown cafe where Brandon had first explicitly threatened me. She looked older somehow, worn down by the emotional weight of discovering who she had really married and what he had planned for our family. "Dad, I owe you the biggest apology of my entire life," she said, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug like it was the only solid thing in her world. "I defended him against you. Even after what he did at the wedding reception, I actually defended his behavior and took his side against my own father." "You loved him," I replied simply. "That's not something you should ever apologize for, sweetheart." "But I should have seen all the warning signs. All those times he talked about your supposed memory problems and confusion. He was systematically setting me up to doubt you and your mental capacity, and his manipulation worked perfectly on me." I reached across the table and took her hand in both of mine. "Sophie, professional manipulators are experts at their craft. They don't target stupid people or weak people. They specifically target trusting, loving people like you. Your capacity to love and trust completely isn't a character weakness. It's one of your greatest strengths as a human being." She was quiet for several long minutes, processing everything that had happened to our family. "The wedding money, Dad, how did you really afford to pay for all of that? I know what you make on your pension, and that reception cost more than you earn in a year." I told her the complete truth about the 18 months of night shifts. The sold Camaro, the months of sacrifice I had carefully hidden from her. I watched her face crumble as she realized the full extent of what I had given up to make her dreams come true. $85,000, she whispered. "Dad, that was literally everything you had saved for your retirement." "No," I corrected her gently. "Everything I had was seeing you happy on the most important day of your life. The money was just the tool I used to make that happiness possible." As Sophie insisted on repaying every single penny, though we both knew it would take her several years of careful budgeting to manage it. She moved back into her old childhood bedroom temporarily, claiming she needed time to figure out her next steps. But I knew she was really making sure I was okay after everything our family had been through. The house felt truly alive again with her presence filling the rooms. She made coffee exactly the way Mary used to, filled our home with laughter and music and conversation, reminded me that family isn't just about protecting each other from danger, it's about healing together when the protection actually works. 6 months after the trial, Sophie met David Wilson, a kindergarten teacher at the elementary school where she had started volunteering to work with children who needed reading help. He was kind, patient, honest about his finances, and most importantly, he asked my permission respectfully before proposing to my daughter. Their wedding next spring will be smaller, simpler, and paid for entirely with money that was honestly earned and openly discussed. As for Brandon Phillips, he lost his financial advisor license permanently and now faces multiple civil lawsuits from his previous victims across 3 different counties. The district attorney's comprehensive investigation uncovered an extensive network of similar schemes targeting elderly people throughout our region. My case became the keystone evidence that brought down his entire criminal operation and helped recover over $2 million for victims who had thought they would never see justice. The experience taught me something vitally important about the true nature of quiet strength and patient justice. For months after everything was over, people told me I should have confronted Brandon directly from the beginning, demanded he show proper respect, forced the issue into the open immediately. But real power isn't about making noise or creating drama. It's about being patient enough to let the truth reveal itself in its own time and in its own way. I spent 40 years as a professional mechanic learning that some problems will fix themselves if you give them the right conditions and enough time to develop. Brandon was like an engine with a fundamental design flaw. He could run smooth and quiet for a while, but eventually his inherent weakness would destroy him completely from the inside. I didn't have to break him down or destroy him myself. I just had to create the right conditions where his true nature would emerge naturally, then document what happened next with the patience of someone who understood that justice operates on its own timeline. Sometimes the strongest thing you can possibly do is remain quiet, stay completely calm, and trust that the truth will always find its way to the surface eventually. The people who love us deserve our protection, even when they can't see the danger approaching themselves. And sometimes the very best way to protect them is to let the evidence speak louder and more clearly than any argument or confrontation ever could. My name is Daniel Morrison. I'm 64 years old, a father, a widower, and a man who learned that the most important battles in life aren't won with force or anger. They're won with patience, careful preparation, solid evidence, and the quiet confidence that truth will always prevail in the end. If you know someone who might be facing manipulation, financial abuse, or elder exploitation, please share this story with them. Sometimes the people we love most need us to fight battles they can't even see coming. And remember, real strength doesn't always announce itself with grand gestures or dramatic confrontations. Sometimes it just gets up calmly, wipes the cake off its face, and quietly begins building an absolutely unshakable case for justice. The strongest fathers don't just provide financially for their children, they protect them from dangers those children can't even recognize or imagine. And when the time finally comes to choose between staying silent and speaking truth, we choose truth every single time. Not because it's easy or comfortable, but because our children deserve to live in a world where love is honored, respect is earned, and justice always finds its way home.